Tonight, we're going to a small coastal town where morning fog settles into the streets early and the ocean whispers against the rocks. It's a place where time moves a little slower, where letters are still carried by hand and the same paths are walked each day. This is not a story of big events, but of small, quiet moments. A mailbag, a seaside town, and a silent companion walking alongside. Welcome to Dreamyon. The fog rolled in from the Atlantic like it did every morning. Harbor Point woke slowly, the way small coastal towns always do. Fishing boats creaked against wooden docks, their hulls kissing the dark water with gentle rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a bell buoy clanged its lonely warning to ships that rarely came anymore. The scent of salt and seaweed hung thick in the air, mixing with the first traces of coffee brewing in kitchens along Main Street. But there was one resident of Harbor Point who never slept in, fog or no fog. Captain. The orange and white cat stretched on the porch of the old post office, his fur catching the first pale rays of sunrise that managed to pierce through the mist. He was not young anymore, that much was clear from the gray whiskers around his muzzle and the deliberate way he moved, but his amber eyes still held the sharp awareness of a much younger animal. Captain had lived in Harbor Point for as long as anyone could remember, though no one quite agreed on when he'd first appeared or who he'd belonged to originally. These days, he belonged to everyone and to no one, but mostly he belonged to Martha. Martha Henley had been Harbor Point's mail carrier for 32 years. She knew every house, every family, every secret the town held in its crooked streets and weathered buildings. At 64, she still walked her route 6 days a week, her sensible shoes navigating the uneven cobblestones that the town council kept promising to fix but never did. Her mailbag was worn leather, soft from decades of use, and it hung across her shoulders with the comfortable weight of ritual. This particular morning in late September, Martha pushed open the post office door at exactly 6:15, just as she had every workday for 3 decades. The hinges sang their familiar song, and Captain's ears perked up immediately. "Good morning, Captain," Martha said, her voice warm as she bent to scratch behind his ears. "Ready for our rounds?" Captain responded with a rumbling purr that seemed too large for his body. He stood, arched his back in a luxurious stretch, and hopped down from the porch railing with surprising grace. His tail went up like a flag, the white tip swaying like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog. Inside the small post office, Martha sorted through the morning's delivery. There wasn't much. There never was anymore. Most people got their bills and advertisements online now, but Harbor Point still had its holdouts, people who appreciated the weight of paper in their hands, the permanence of ink, the intimacy of a handwritten address. Today's haul included a package for the bishops, probably another order from that catalog they loved, 3 letters for Mrs. Chen at the bookshop, a postcard for young Tommy Anderson from his grandmother in Florida, and a mysterious envelope addressed to the lighthouse keeper in careful, old-fashioned script. Martha loaded everything into her bag, locked up the post office, and set out into the fog. Captain fell into step beside her without being asked. This was their routine, had been almost 7 years now, ever since that first morning when the cat had simply started following her and never stopped. They walked down Main Street, past the shuttered windows of shops that wouldn't open for hours yet. The Mermaid Cafe was already lit up, though, and through the window, Martha could see Joe flipping pancakes on the griddle. The smell of blueberries and butter drifted out, making her stomach rumble. Later, she promised herself, as she always did. Captain paused at the cafe door, sat down, and looked at her with those knowing eyes. "You already had breakfast," Martha reminded him. The cat blinked slowly, which she'd learned meant he disagreed but was too polite to argue. Joe spotted them through the window and waved. Martha waved back. Captain's tail flicked once, twice, then he stood and continued down the sidewalk, leading the way as if he was the one who had been delivering mail for 32 years. Their first stop was always the Hendersons' place, a blue Victorian house with white trim that sat on the corner of Main and Seaglass Lane. The house had a wraparound porch with a swing that creaked even when no one was sitting in it, and flower boxes that Mrs. Henderson filled with pansies in spring and mums in fall. Now, in late September, the mums were deep burgundy and gold, colors that reminded Martha of the season changing. Captain bounded up the porch steps ahead of her. He knew the routine better than some people knew their own morning habits. He sat beside the mailbox, an old brass thing shaped like a ship, and waited. Martha loaded out a subscription magazine and 2 letters, tucked them into the mailbox, and raised the little red flag. As she did, the front door opened a crack. "Morning, Martha. Morning, Captain." Mrs. Henderson stood in her wraparound, her silver hair in curlers, holding a small bowl. She was 78 and had lived in Harbor Point her entire life, just like her mother before her. "Morning, Eleanor," Martha replied. Mrs. Henderson set the bowl down on the porch, milk, just a little, the way Captain preferred it. The cat approached with dignified steps, sniffed politely, and began to lap at the milk with delicate precision. "Anything interesting today?" Mrs. Henderson asked, the same question she asked every morning. "Just your garden and home magazine and what looks like a letter from your niece in Boston." "Oh, wonderful! Sarah writes the loveliest letters. None of this email business for her, thank goodness." Eleanor smiled at Captain, who had finished the milk and was now rubbing against her ankles. "Such a gentleman, this one." "That he is," Martha agreed. They chatted for another minute about the weather, rain coming in by afternoon probably, and about the town council meeting next week, where they'd once again discuss what to do about the old cannery building that had been sitting empty for 15 years. Then Martha and Captain were on their way again, down Seaglass Lane toward the cluster of houses near the harbor. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the skeleton of the old fishing fleet tied up at the docks. Most of the boats hadn't been out in years. Harbor Point's fishing industry had died a slow death over the past 2 decades, victim of regulations and economics, and young people who moved to cities where the jobs were. Only a handful of lobstermen still worked the waters now, and even they were mostly older men, doing it more out of habit than profit. But the town endured. It always had. Captain led Martha down a narrow alley between 2 houses, a shortcut to Anchor Street that only locals knew about. His paws made no sound on the smooth stones, worn down by a century of footsteps. Martha's shoes, by contrast, echoed softly in the quiet morning. They emerged onto Anchor Street just as Mr. Kowalski was coming out of his house with his fishing gear. He was one of the holdouts, a lobsterman who'd been working these waters for 40 years. His hands were weathered as driftwood, his face creased by sun and salt. "Morning, Stan. Heading out?" "Hiya. Weather's gonna turn later. Want to check my pots before it does." Captain walked over and rubbed against Mr. Kowalski's leg. The old lobsterman reached down and gave him a rough but affectionate scratch. "Got something for you," Martha said, pulling a small package from her bag. "Looks like it's from your daughter." Mr. Kowalski's weathered face softened. "Amy's good about sending things. She worries I don't eat right." "Do you?" He grunted, which wasn't really an answer, and took the package. "Thanks, Martha. You too, Captain." The cat meowed once, a sound of acknowledgement, and then they were moving again. House by house, mailbox by mailbox, they made their way through Harbor Point. At the bishop's house, a yellow cottage with a green door, Martha left the package on the porch because they never woke before 9. Captain waited patiently, then followed her to the next house. At the bookshop where Mrs. Chen lived above her store, Martha slipped the letters through the mail slot, and Captain sat on the doorstep listening to the sound of them hitting the floor inside. At Tommy Anderson's house, a ramshackle place badly in need of paint, Martha rang the bell because she knew the boy would want to see his grandmother's postcard right away. Sure enough, Tommy came running to the door in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in 6 different directions. "Is it from Grandma?" he asked breathlessly. Martha handed him the postcard. It showed a flamingo standing in impossibly blue water, and on the back his grandmother had written about the weather and the birds and how much she missed him. Tommy's face lit up like sunrise. "Thanks, Miss Martha. Thanks, Captain." Captain meowed, and Tommy laughed, that pure sound children make when something delights them completely. He knelt down, and Captain allowed himself to be petted, even nuzzled the boy's hand, before Martha gently reminded Tommy that he should probably get ready for school. They continued their route, the sun climbing higher, the fog burning off to reveal a sky of pale blue. The scent of the ocean was everywhere, but now it mingled with other smells. Wood smoke from chimneys, bacon frying, the earthy smell of Mrs. Patterson's garden, where she grew tomatoes that refused to recognize the coming of autumn. By 8:30, they'd covered most of the town. Martha's bag was nearly empty, and Captain showed no signs of tiring, though she knew that once they finished, he'd find a sunny spot and sleep for hours, conserving his energy for tomorrow's route. Their last stop was always the lighthouse. The old Harbor Point light stood at the end of a rocky promontory, a white tower with a red cap that guided ships since 1889. It wasn't operational anymore, hadn't been for 20 years, replaced by modern navigation systems and GPS, but the town maintained it as a historical landmark. And someone still lived there, in the keeper's cottage attached to the tower's base. The path to the lighthouse was rough, more rock than road, and it climbed steeply up from the town. Martha took her time, and Captain bounded ahead, sure-footed as a mountain goat despite his age. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. Waves crashed against the rocks below, sending up spray that caught the morning light and turned it into brief rainbows. The keeper's cottage was small but well-maintained, with a red door and window boxes where herbs grew in wild profusion. Smoke curled from the chimney, and as Martha approached, she could smell coffee and something baking, maybe bread or scones. She pulled out the mysterious envelope, the one with the careful old-fashioned script, and studied it for a moment. It was addressed simply, Lighthouse Keeper, Harbor Point, Maine. No name, no street number, just that. Before she could knock, the door opened. The keeper's name was Samuel Frost, though everyone called him Sam. He'd arrived in Harbor Point 3 years ago, answering an advertisement the town council had placed for someone to maintain the lighthouse and give tours during the summer months. He was in his early 50s, with silver threading through dark hair, and the kind of quiet manner that made people comfortable around him. "Good morning, Martha," he said, his voice soft. "Morning, Captain." Captain trotted inside without waiting for an invitation, heading straight for the fireplace, where a comfortable chair waited. "Letter for you," Martha said, handing over the envelope. "Interesting address." Sam took it, studied the handwriting, and something flickered across his face. Recognition? Surprise? but was gone too quickly for Martha to read. "Thank you," he said. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a pot and I've got blueberry scones coming out of the oven in about 2 minutes." Martha knew she should say no, knew she had to get back to the post office, knew she had a dozen other things to do, but the smell of those scones was irresistible, and besides, Sam Frost made the best coffee in Harbor Point. "Just a quick cup," she said. Inside, the cottage was cozy in the way that small spaces can be when they're well loved. Books lined every wall, spines worn from reading. A fire crackled in the fireplace where Captain had already claimed the best chair and was kneading the cushion with his paws. Nautical charts were tacked to one wall, and an old ship's clock ticked steadily on the mantel. Sam poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs and pulled the scones from the oven. They were perfect, golden brown, studded with berries that had burst slightly, sending purple streaks through the dough. "These are from Mrs. Patterson's garden," Sam said, gesturing to the berries. "She brought me a bucket yesterday, said they were the last of the season." They sat at a small table by the window where they could look out at the ocean. The water was calm this morning, rolling in long swells that spoke of distant storms. A lobster boat chugged past, heading out to check pots. Captain purred by the fire. Martha sipped her coffee, strong, black, perfect, and took a bite of scone. It was still warm, the berries tart and sweet at once. "So," she said, because she'd been Harbor Point's mail carrier long enough to know when someone had received unexpected news. "That letter, someone you know?" Sam was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his hands. The envelope sat on the table between them, unopened. "Someone I used to know," he said finally, "a long time ago." Martha waited. She'd learned that sometimes silence was the best question. "My sister," Sam continued, his voice soft. "We haven't spoken in almost 20 years. I didn't think she knew where I was." "Family can be complicated," Martha said, which was both true and an understatement. "Yes," Sam looked out at the ocean, "but maybe it's time to stop letting it be." He picked up the envelope, slid his finger under the flap, and carefully opened it. Martha tactfully turned her attention to her scone, giving him privacy. She could hear the whisper of paper unfolding, a long silence, then a breath that might have been relief or regret or both. When she looked up, Sam was smiling, though his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She's coming to visit," he said. "Next month. She wants to meet me here, see where I've been living. She says it's time to be family again." "That's wonderful, Sam." "Yeah." He folded the letter carefully, reverently. "Yeah, it is." They finished their coffee and scones in comfortable silence, broken only by Captain's periodic purrs and the distant sound of waves. When Martha finally stood to leave, Sam walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the letter, for this, the coffee, the company." "Any time," Martha told him, and meant it. Captain stretched, hopped down from the chair, and followed Martha out into the morning. The sun was fully up now, the fog completely gone, and Harbor Point lay below them like a postcard of itself, weathered and beautiful and enduring. They walked back down the rocky path together, mail carrier and cat, as they had every morning for 7 years. Below them, the town was fully awake now. Shops were opening, people were walking to work, children were heading to school. Smoke rose from chimneys, cars moved slowly down Main Street, and from the harbor came the sound of men calling to each other as they worked. Martha looked down at Captain, who was picking his way carefully between rocks, his tail high and proud. "Good work today, partner," she said. Captain looked up at her and meowed once, firmly, as if to say he knew that already. And maybe he did. Maybe that was the secret to his success as Harbor Point's unofficial assistant mail carrier. He understood that delivering mail wasn't really about envelopes and packages. It was about connection, about being the thread that tied a community together, about making sure no one was forgotten or alone. They reached Main Street just as the Mermaid Cafe's breakfast rush was starting. Joe Chen saw them through the window and waved them inside. Captain trotted in like he owned the place and immediately received attention from half a dozen customers who'd known him for years. Someone had already put down a saucer with a small piece of bacon on it. Martha ordered her usual, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and more of that perfect coffee, and sat at the counter. Around her, Harbor Point hummed with the gentle rhythm of morning. People talked about weather and work, about family and plans, about nothing and everything. And in the middle of it all, an orange and white cat accepted tribute from his admirers, purring loudly enough to be heard over the breakfast chatter. Tomorrow they would do it all again. The fog would roll in, Martha would sort the mail, and Captain would be waiting on the post office porch, ready to make his rounds. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. In a small coastal town in Maine, where the ocean whispered secrets to the rocks and the lighthouse stood watch over memories, a mail carrier and a cat carried more than letters. They carried Harbor Point itself, one delivery at a time. October arrived in Harbor Point the way it always did, quietly and without fanfare. The leaves on the handful of maple trees that grew along Main Street turned from green to gold, then to a deep crimson that looked like fire against the gray Atlantic sky. The air took on a crisp quality that made people reach for sweaters in the morning and light fires in the evening. Pumpkins appeared on porches, and Mrs. Patterson's garden finally surrendered to the season, though she stubbornly kept harvesting the last of her tomatoes well into the first week of the month. Captain's routine never changed, though Martha noticed he seemed to enjoy the cooler weather. His pace had a bit more spring to it on chilly mornings, and he'd taken to sitting in patches of sunlight whenever they paused during their rounds, soaking up warmth like a battery charging. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Sam Frost had received his sister's letter, when Martha noticed something different. The post office had an unusual amount of mail that day, a rare occurrence in the digital age. There were the usual bills and advertisements, but also a surprising number of personal letters. Mrs. Henderson had 3 envelopes from different relatives. The Bishops had a thick packet from their son in California. Even grumpy old Mr. Davies, who lived alone in a cottage by the cannery and rarely received anything, had a postcard. But the item that caught Martha's attention was a large envelope addressed to Sam Frost at the lighthouse. The return address was from Portland, and the handwriting was the same careful script as the first letter. "Looks like Sam's sister is keeping in touch," Martha said to Captain, who was sitting on the counter watching her sort. The cat's ears twitched, his version of acknowledgement. They set out into the morning, which was particularly beautiful. The fog had lifted early, revealing a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The ocean was calm, its surface like hammered silver in the early light. Fishing boats bobbed gently at their moorings, and somewhere a dog barked, the sound carrying clearly in the crisp air. Their route took them past the Mermaid Cafe, where Joe Chen was setting up the outdoor tables for what might be one of the last warm days of the season. He waved, and Captain paused long enough to receive a scratch behind the ears before continuing on. At the Hendersons' house, Eleanor was already waiting on the porch, wrapped in a quilted jacket and holding her morning tea. "3 letters today," Martha announced, climbing the porch steps. "You're popular." "Oh my," Eleanor said, taking them with trembling hands, arthritis, which got worse as the weather turned. "This one's from my sister in Virginia, and this is my cousin Margaret's handwriting, and, oh, this is from Thomas." Her voice caught slightly on the last name. Thomas was her grandson, a Marine stationed overseas. He didn't write often. "Good news, I hope," Martha said gently. "Any word from him is good news." Eleanor clutched the letters to her chest. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a pot." "Can't today, Eleanor. Got a full load to deliver." Captain, who had been investigating an interesting smell near the porch swing, suddenly went very still. His ears swiveled forward, his tail dropped low, and he stared intently at something Martha couldn't see. "Captain?" Martha said. "What is it, boy?" The cat took 2 steps forward, stopped, then sat down and began grooming his paw with intense concentration, his way of saying he'd noticed something but deemed it unimportant for now. "That cat," Eleanor said fondly. "He sees things we don't, I swear." They said their goodbyes, and Martha and Captain continued their route. But Martha noticed that Captain kept looking back over his shoulder toward the direction of the harbor, as if he'd heard something that still bothered him. By the time they reached Anchor Street, the sun was higher and the day was warming nicely. Mr. Kolowaski was loading his truck with lobster traps, preparing for a day on the water. His movements were slower than they used to be, Martha noticed. The years were catching up with all of them. "Morning, Stan," she called. He straightened, one hand going to his lower back in a gesture that had become habitual. "Martha, Captain." "Got a magazine for you, Coastal Fisherman." "Good, been waiting for that one. They're doing a piece on sustainable lobstering practices." He took the magazine, tucked it under his arm. "Say, either of you seen anything unusual this morning? Thought I saw lights down by the old cannery last night. Might have been kids messing around." Martha shook her head. "Haven't heard anything. Want me to mention it to Chief Morrison?" "Nah, probably nothing. Just made me curious is all." He glanced at Captain, who was sitting very straight, staring in the direction of the cannery. "Cat sees it, doesn't he?" "He's been acting a bit odd this morning," Martha admitted. "Animals know things," Mr. Kolowaski said it matter-of-factly, the way people who'd spent their lives working close to nature often did. "My dog used to know when a storm was coming 3 days before the weather service did." They chatted for another minute about the weather forecast, rain expected by the weekend, before Martha and Captain moved on. But now Martha found herself paying more attention to Captain's behavior. The cat was definitely more alert than usual, his ears constantly swiveling, his pace just a slightly quicker. When they reached the old cannery, Captain stopped completely. The building was a hulking presence at the edge of the harbor, 3 stories of red brick and broken windows that had been sitting empty since the fishing industry collapsed. The town council argued every year about what to do with it, tear it down, renovate it, sell it, but never reached a decision. So it sat, slowly decaying, a monument to Harbor Point's more prosperous past. Captain sat down in the middle of the sidewalk and stared at the building. "What is it?" Martha asked, following his gaze. The cannery looked the same as it always did, abandoned, slightly ominous, with seabirds nesting in the broken windows and weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock. But there was something, Martha couldn't quite put her finger on it, a sense of wrongness maybe, or just her imagination, fed by Mr. Kolowaski's comment about lights. "Come on, Captain, we've got deliveries to make." The cat didn't move for a long moment, then finally stood and followed her, though he kept looking back at the cannery. The rest of the morning proceeded normally. Tommy Anderson was thrilled with a small package from his grandmother, homemade cookies, he announced after tearing it open. Mrs. Chin at the bookshop invited them in to see a new shipment of books, and Captain spent 15 minutes exploring the shelves, rubbing his scent on his favorite spots. The Bishops were home for once, and Mrs. Bishop gave Captain a treat from the special jar she kept just for him. By the time they started up the rocky path to the lighthouse, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The day had turned genuinely warm, and Martha was glad she'd left her heavy jacket at the post office. Captain seemed to have forgotten about whatever had bothered him earlier and was now more interested in investigating the tide pools along the path, where small crabs scuttled between rocks. Sam Frost was outside the lighthouse cottage, working in the small garden where he grew vegetables. He'd been harvesting the last of the season's crop, and a basket beside him was filled with the final tomatoes, some squash, and a handful of late-blooming herbs. "Martha," he called, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Captain, right on time as always." Captain trotted over and received his customary greeting, a scratch behind the ears and under the chin, the spots he liked best. "Big envelope for you today," Martha said, pulling it from her bag. "From your sister?" Sam's face lit up in a way Martha hadn't seen before. "Yes, she's been sending information about her family. I have a niece and nephew I've never met. They're teenagers now." He took the envelope carefully, as if it might break. "She's arriving next week. I can't believe it's really happening." "The cottage is looking good," Martha observed. And it was true. Sam had clearly been preparing for his sister's visit. The windows gleamed, the garden was tidy, and there were fresh curtains visible through the windows. "I want her to see that I'm doing well here," Sam said, "that I made the right choice coming to Harbor Point." "Did you make the right choice?" Sam looked out at the ocean, which stretched to the horizon in shades of blue and gray. A lobster boat was working in the distance, its bright buoys marking the location of traps. Seabirds wheeled overhead, and the lighthouse stood solid and white against the autumn sky. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I did. I needed this place. The quiet, the simplicity, time to think, to heal from a lot of things." Martha waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "My sister and I fought about it 20 years ago when I left the city, left everything behind. She thought I was running away, being irresponsible. She was probably right, but I wasn't ready to hear it then. And now? Now I understand that we were both right in our own ways. She was building a life, starting a family, doing all the things you're supposed to do. I needed something different. Took me a long time to be okay with that." Captain, who had been exploring the garden, suddenly jumped onto the stone wall that bordered the lighthouse property. He sat very still, staring down toward the town, his tail flicking slowly. "He's been doing that all morning," Martha said, acting like he senses something. Sam followed Captain's gaze. From up here, they could see most of Harbor Point spread out below, the clustered houses, the harbor with its fishing boats, Main Street with its shops, and at the far end, the old cannery. "Might be a storm coming," Sam suggested. "Animals can feel changes in air pressure." But Martha wasn't so sure. She'd seen Captain sense storms before, and this felt different. This felt like anticipation, like something was about to change. They talked for a while longer, mostly about Sam's sister's visit and his plans to show her around Harbor Point. Martha suggested he take her to the Mermaid Cafe for Joe's famous lobster roll and to Mrs. Chin's bookshop, which had the best selection of maritime history books on the coast. When Martha finally said goodbye and started back down the path, Captain remained on the wall for a long moment, still staring at the town. Then, with a decisive flick of his tail, he jumped down and trotted after her, taking his usual position slightly ahead, leading the way. They were halfway back to town when Captain suddenly veered off the main path, heading toward a narrow trail that wound along the cliff edge. Martha had walked that trail before. It offered beautiful views of the ocean, but it wasn't part of their normal route. "Captain," she called, "where are you going?" The cat looked back at her, meowed once, and continued down the trail. Martha hesitated, then followed. She trusted Captain's instincts. In 7 years of walking together, he'd never led her astray. The trail curved around an outcropping of rock, and suddenly Martha could see a small cove below, accessible only by a steep path that most people didn't know existed. And there, pulled up on the narrow beach, was a small boat that hadn't been there yesterday. It was a dinghy, old but well-maintained, painted dark blue with white trim. No name was visible from this distance, but Martha could see oars lying in the bottom and what looked like a pack covered with a tarp. Captain sat at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the boat with intense interest. "Well," Martha said quietly, "that's new." They stood there for several minutes, watching, but nothing moved. The boat rocked gently in the small waves that rolled into the cove, and seabirds called from the rocks, but there was no sign of whoever had left it there. Finally, Martha checked her watch. It was past midday, and she needed to get back to the post office. There was paperwork to file, and she had a dentist appointment at 2. "Come on," she said to Captain. "We'll mention it to the chief later. Probably just someone who stopped to fish or explore." But as they walked back to town, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that the boat's appearance was connected to whatever had been bothering Captain all morning. The cannery, the boat, Captain's unusual alertness, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite see yet. Harbor Point was a small town where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were rare and usually announced themselves. Someone arriving by boat and not immediately making their presence known was unusual. They reached the post office just as Martha's assistant, a young woman named Sarah who worked part-time, was locking up for lunch. "Hey, Martha. Hey, Captain." Sarah bent to pet the cat, who graciously allowed it. "Quiet morning. Only one person came in and they just wanted stamps." "Thanks, Sarah. I'll be back by 2:30. Martha went inside, did her paperwork quickly, and was about to head to her dentist appointment when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. She was already running late, but something made her pick it up. "Hello? Harbor Point Post Office?" "It's Martha. It's Helen Morrison." The police chief's wife sounded worried. "Is Jack there? He's not answering his radio and I need to reach him." "No, I haven't seen him. Is everything okay?" "Probably nothing, but Mrs. Davis called and said she saw someone hanging around the old cannery this morning. Jack went to check it out, and that was 2 hours ago. He always calls to let me know he's okay, and—" "I'm sure he's fine, Helen. You know how he gets when he's investigating something, loses track of time." "You're right, I'm being silly." But Helen didn't sound convinced. "If you see him, though, tell him to call me?" "Of course." Martha hung up the phone and looked at Captain, who was sitting by the door, watching her with those amber eyes that seemed to see more than a cat should. "You knew something was off, didn't you?" she said. Captain meowed. Martha picked up the phone again and dialed the police station. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. She tried Chief Morrison's cell phone next. Same thing, straight to voicemail. Now she was worried too. Harbor Point had virtually no crime. The police department consisted of Chief Morrison and 2 part-time officers who mostly dealt with parking tickets and the occasional drunk tourist. If Helen was worried enough to call around looking for her husband, and if the chief wasn't answering his phone, Martha made a decision. She locked up the post office, hung the "back at 3" sign on the door, and headed toward the cannery. Captain fell into step beside her without being asked, his tail high, his pace quick. They walked down Main Street, past shops that were busy with the lunch crowd, past the Mermaid Cafe where Joe Chen was serving lobster rolls to tourists who'd driven up from Portland for the day. No one paid much attention to a male terrier and her cat, which was exactly how Martha wanted it. The cannery loomed ahead, looking more derelict than ever in the bright afternoon light. The loading dock was empty except for some old pallets and a rusted-out wheelbarrow that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. The main entrance was boarded up, had been for years, but Martha knew there were other ways in. Broken windows on the ground floor, a side door that no longer locked properly. Chief Morrison's patrol car was parked on the street nearby, empty. Captain stopped at the edge of the cannery property and sat down, every muscle in his body tense. His ears were flat against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, something Martha had never heard from him before. "It's okay," she said softly, though she wasn't sure it was. "Stay here. I'm just going to look around." But when she started forward, Captain darted ahead of her, leading the way to the side door. He sat beside it and looked up at her, waiting. The door was slightly ajar. Martha pushed it open slowly. The hinges creaked, a sound that echoed in the cavernous space beyond. Sunlight filtered through broken windows high above, creating shafts of dusty light that illuminated a vast empty space where machinery had once stood. The air smelled of rust and salt and decay. "Chief Morrison?" Martha called. Her voice echoed back to her. "Jack, it's Martha Henley." No answer. Captain slipped inside, his white-tipped tail disappearing into the shadows. Martha followed, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained, littered with debris, old boards, broken glass, scraps of metal. Graffiti covered the lower walls, the work of bored teenagers over many years. "Jack?" Martha called again. This time she heard something, a faint sound, like knocking, tapping. Captain's ears swiveled toward the sound, and he started moving deeper into the building. Martha followed carefully, watching her footing, her heart beating faster than it should. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere toward the back of the building where the old offices had been. Captain led her through a doorway into a narrower corridor, darker than the main floor. There were doors along both sides, most of them standing open to reveal empty rooms filled with nothing but shadows and dust. But one door was closed, and the knocking was coming from behind it. "Jack?" Martha called. "Is that you?" "Martha?" The chief's voice was muffled but unmistakable. "Thank God! The door's stuck. I can't get it open from this side." Martha tried the handle. It turned, but the door wouldn't budge. Something was blocking it from inside, or the frame had warped. She put her shoulder against it and pushed. Nothing. "Hold on," she called. "I'm going to get help." "No, wait." Chief Morrison sounded embarrassed. "There's a window, small, but you might be able to reach through and move whatever's blocking the door, around the corner on the outside wall." Martha and Captain went back outside and around to where the chief had indicated. Sure enough, there was a small window set high in the wall. It was broken, like most of the cannery's windows, but the opening was narrow. "I see it," she called. "Can you reach in? There's a board wedged edged a handle on my side, if you can knock it loose." Martha looked at the window, then at Captain, who was sitting nearby watching this whole operation with interest. "I've got a better idea," she said. She took off her jacket, wrapped it around her hand, and carefully cleared away the remaining glass from the window frame. Then she picked up Captain, who accepted this with his usual dignity, and held him up to the window. "Captain," she said firmly, "inside, help the chief." The cat looked at her, then at the window, then back at her. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Cats weren't dogs, after all. They didn't take orders. But then Captain leaned forward, assessed the opening, and with a graceful leap, disappeared through the window. Martha heard him land inside, heard the chief's surprised laugh, and then heard the distinctive sound of wood clattering on concrete. A moment later, the door opened from inside, and Chief Morrison emerged looking sheepish and dusty, with Captain trotting proudly at his heels. "Well, that's embarrassing," the chief said. "What happened?" Jack Morrison was a solid man in his late 50s, with the kind of practical competence that made him perfect for law enforcement in a small town. But right now, he looked more like a kid who'd been caught doing something foolish. "Got a call about someone being seen around the cannery, came to check it out, found that side door open, same as you did, went inside to look around, stepped into that office to check it out, and the door swung shut behind me. Must have been a draft or something. The board fell and wedged under the handle, and I couldn't get it open from this side." He shook his head. "Couldn't call for help because my radio doesn't work in here, too much metal in the structure, and I left my cell phone in the car like an idiot." "Helen's worried about you." I know. I'll call her as soon as I get back to the car." He looked down at Captain and scratched behind the cat's ears. "Thanks, partner. You're a better deputy than most humans I know." Captain purred, accepting the compliment as his due. They walked back around to the front of the cannery together. Martha retrieved her jacket, and the chief got his phone from the patrol car to call his wife. While he was explaining to Helen what had happened, with considerable self-deprecation, Martha looked at the cannery again. "Did you find anything?" she asked when he'd hung up. "Any sign of who's been hanging around?" "Nothing obvious. Some fresh footprints in the dust on the main floor, but could be from anyone. Kids, homeless person passing through, curious tourist. He paused. Though I did find this. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolded it carefully. It was a page torn from a sketchbook, and on it was a detailed pencil drawing of the cannery's main floor, showing the layout of where machinery had once stood. Notes were written in the margins, measurements maybe, or observations. "Someone's documenting the building," Martha said. "Looks like it. Question is, why?" Captain, who had been sitting quietly nearby, suddenly stood and walked over to the patrol car. He jumped up onto the hood, something he never did as he was generally more respectful of property, and stared down the street toward the harbor. Martha and the chief followed his gaze. A figure was walking up the street toward them, tall, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. As they got closer, Martha could see it was a woman, probably in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She saw them watching and slowed her pace, but didn't stop or turn away. Instead, she walked right up to them with the kind of calm directness that suggested she'd been expecting this confrontation. "Chief Morrison?" she said, her voice pleasant but cautious. "I'm guessing you're looking for whoever's been in the cannery." "That would be you?" the chief asked, not unfriendly but professional. "Yes, sir. My name is Rachel Kim. I'm an architectural historian from Portland." I pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to him. "I should have checked in with you when I arrived. I apologize for that. I didn't think anyone would mind me looking at an abandoned building." Harbor Point's small. People notice strangers, and the cannery's technically town property, even if it's not being used. "I understand. Again, I apologize." Rachel looked at the building with an expression that Martha recognized, the same look people got when they saw something they loved. "You're staying in Harbor Point?" the chief asked. "Yes, sir. I've got a room at the Harbor View Inn for the next 2 weeks. I'm trying to document as many of these buildings as I can before winter sets in. Next time, check in first and stay out of the cannery unless you've got official permission from the town." "Understood." Rachel looked disappointed but accepting. Then her gaze fell on Captain, who was still sitting on the patrol car hood, watching her with those assessing amber eyes. "Is that your cat?" "He's everyone's cat, but he's my mail route partner. This is Captain." "Hello, Captain." Rachel approached slowly, holding her hand for the cat to sniff. Captain stood, walked across the hood with perfect balance, and allowed her to scratch under his chin. His purr was audible from 6 feet away. "He likes you," Martha observed. "I like him," Rachel smiled, and it transformed her face from serious to warm. "I've always had a soft spot for orange cats. They have such personalities." They talked for a few more minutes, with Rachel promising to stop by the town hall to inquire about official access to the cannery, and the chief giving her his card in case she needed anything during her stay. Then Rachel headed back toward the harbor, and the chief got in his car to finish his rounds. Martha and Captain walked back to the post office together, the autumn sun warm on their shoulders. The mystery of the stranger in town was solved, the chief was safe, and everything could return to normal. Except Captain kept looking back toward the harbor where Rachel had disappeared, and Martha found herself wondering if an architectural historian from Portland was really what Rachel Kim was. Back at the post office, Sarah had returned from lunch and was sorting the afternoon delivery, sparse as always. Martha filed her paperwork, answered a few emails, and checked the schedule for tomorrow's route. Everything normal, everything routine. But when she locked up at 5 o'clock and headed home to her small house on Birch Street, she found herself thinking about boats in hidden coves and strangers with sketchbooks and the way Captain had acted all day like he'd known something was coming. Harbor Point was a quiet town. Things didn't change quickly here. The rhythms were as predictable as the tides. So why did Martha feel like something was about to shift? She made herself dinner, leftover stew from the weekend, reheated, and ate while reading a mystery novel she'd picked up from Mrs. Chen's bookshop. But she couldn't concentrate on the story. Her mind kept wandering to Sam Frost waiting for his sister, to Rachel Kim documenting old buildings, to Chief Morrison trapped in the cannery, to Captain sensing something that hadn't yet revealed itself. She was washing her dishes when her phone rang. It was Eleanor Henderson. "Martha? I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Eleanor. Is everything okay?" "Oh, yes, dear. I just wanted to tell you, I opened that letter from Thomas today. He's coming home, not for good, but for a visit. He'll be here in 3 weeks." Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion. "I haven't seen him in 2 years." "That's wonderful news." "It is. It really is. And Martha, thank you for delivering these letters every day, for connecting us all. Sometimes I think you and Captain are the real heart of this town." After they hung up, Martha stood at her kitchen window, looking out at Harbor Point's twinkling lights. Somewhere out there, Captain was probably curled up in whatever warm spot he'd claimed for the night. Tomorrow morning, he'd be on the post office porch, waiting to start our rounds again. And Martha realized that Eleanor was right. They were connectors, she and Captain, not just delivering mail, but delivering hope, news, connection, all the things that made a community more than just a collection of buildings by the sea. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of the rain that was supposed to arrive by the weekend. The ocean murmured its eternal song against the rocks. And somewhere in the darkness, Harbor Point settled into sleep, secure in the routines that held it together. Tomorrow would bring new deliveries, new connections, new small moments that made up the fabric of life in a coastal town. Martha was looking forward to it. The rain arrived on Friday, just as predicted. It started before dawn, a gentle pattering that gradually built to a steady drumming on rooftops and windows. By the time Martha arrived at the post office at 6:15, the streets were slick and shining, and puddles had formed in the low spots where the cobblestones dipped. The fog was back too, rolling in from the ocean in thick gray waves that made the town feel smaller, more intimate, as if Harbor Point had pulled a blanket over itself. Captain was waiting on the porch, as always, but he'd taken shelter under the overhang near the door. His orange and white fur was completely dry, suggesting he'd been smart enough to arrive early and claim the protected spot. When Martha approached, he stood and shook himself, a gesture more of greeting than necessity. "Morning, Captain," Martha said, unlocking the door. "Looks like we're in for a wet one." The cat followed her inside, shaking his paws delicately as if offended by the dampness. Martha smiled and pulled out the mail carrier's rain gear from the back closet. A waterproof jacket with the Postal Service logo, waterproof pants, and a hat with a brim that would keep the rain out of her eyes. She'd worn this outfit countless times over 32 years, and it fit like an old friend. The morning's mail was lighter than usual. People tended to send less when the weather turned bad, as if the rain affected their correspondence as much as their outdoor activities. But there were still deliveries to make, a package for Mrs. Chen at the bookshop, some letters for the Hendersons, a thick manila envelope for Sam Frost at the lighthouse, and surprisingly, a postcard for Rachel Kim at the Harbor View Inn. She studied that last item with interest. The postcard showed the Portland Head Light, one of Maine's most famous lighthouses, and the message on the back was brief. "Thinking of you. Stay safe. M." She tucked it into her bag with the rest of the mail, helped Captain into his small rain jacket, a ridiculous item that Mrs. Bishop had sewn for him 3 years ago, complete with a hood that he refused to wear, and stepped out into the rain. The town looked different in weather like this. The colors were muted, softened by the mist and rain. Sounds carried strangely. Some seemed amplified, others were swallowed entirely. The ocean was invisible beyond the fog, but Martha could hear it, the waves louder than usual, crashing against the rocks with more force. Their first stop was the Hendersons' house, where Eleanor was waiting with towels and hot coffee. "I saw you coming," she said, opening the door wide. "Come in, both of you. You must be soaked." "We're fine, Eleanor," Martha protested, but Eleanor was already ushering them inside, taking Martha's dripping jacket and toweling off Captain, who submitted to this treatment with patient dignity. "I won't keep you long," Eleanor said, hanging the jacket to drip over her bathtub. "But I wanted to tell you, I got a call from Thomas last night. He's definitely coming home, November 15th. He'll be here for a whole week." "That's wonderful." "It is. It really is." Eleanor poured coffee into a thermos and pressed it into Martha's hands. "Take this. It'll keep you warm on your rounds. I put extra sugar in it the way you like." They chatted for a few more minutes about Thomas's visit, about the weather, about the town council meeting that had been postponed because of the rain. Then Martha and Captain were back outside, the coffee warming Martha's hands through her gloves, the rain steady but not unpleasant. At the bookshop, Mrs. Chin took her package, more books, always more books, and invited them to stay a while. The shop was warm and dry, filled with the smell of old paper and the lavender sachets Mrs. Chin tucked between the shelves. Captain immediately found his favorite spot on the windowsill and curled up to watch the rain. "How's business?" Martha asked, cradling her coffee. "Slow," she admitted, "but steady. The tourists are mostly gone for the season, but the locals still come in. And I've started selling online, which helps. Joe convinced me to set up a website." She smiled. "My son helped me. He says I'm finally joining the 21st century." They talked about books. Mrs. Chin had just finished a wonderful mystery set in Scotland, and about the stranger who'd been documenting the cannery. Rachel Kim stopped by yesterday, bought 3 books on Maine's industrial history. She seems genuinely interested, not just going through the motions. I liked her. I did too. She asked about the cannery, about what it was like when it was operating. I told her about my grandfather, how he worked there for 40 years. She wrote everything down, like it mattered. Mrs. Chin refilled Martha's coffee from her own pot. It's nice when someone cares about our history. Most people just see an old building that should be torn down. The council's talking about it again. They're always talking about it. They'll never actually do anything. Mrs. Chin looked fondly at Captain, who was now grooming himself on the windowsill. "That cat has the right idea. Find a comfortable spot and wait for the world to sort itself out." Martha and Captain left the bookshop and continued their rounds. The rain was coming down harder now, and even with her waterproof gear, Martha could feel dampness seeping in at the collar and cuffs. Captain's rain jacket was keeping him mostly dry, though he still picked his way carefully around puddles, trying to keep his paws as clean as possible. They delivered mail to the Bishops, to Mr. Davies, to half a dozen other houses along their usual route. At Mr. Kowalski's place, they found him on his porch mending a lobster trap. "Too rough to go out today," he explained, his weathered hands working the rope with practiced efficiency. "Seas are running 6 to 8 feet, maybe higher by afternoon." "Stay safe," Martha told him. "Always do." He looked at Captain. "Cat's smarter than most people, wearing a rain jacket." Captain's look suggested he disagreed about the jacket's intelligence, but he accepted the compliment anyway. By the time they reached the path to the lighthouse, it was past 10 o'clock, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. The path was slippery, the rocks treacherous with wet, and Martha took her time climbing. Captain bounded ahead as always, sure-footed even in the worst conditions, occasionally looking back to make sure Martha was keeping up. The lighthouse loomed out of the fog like a ghost, its white paint gleaming wet, the red cap barely visible through the mist. Lights were on in the cottage, warm and welcoming, and smoke curled from the chimney, only to be immediately shredded by the wind. Before Martha could knock, the door opened. Sam Frost stood there, but he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, late 40s, with the same dark hair and gray eyes as Sam, although her face was rounder, softer. She wore jeans and a thick sweater, and she was smiling at Martha with genuine warmth. "You must be Martha," she said. "Sam's told me so much about you, and this must be Captain." "Martha, this is my sister Anne," Sam said, and his voice held a happiness Martha had never heard before. "She arrived yesterday, a week early, wanted to surprise me." "It's wonderful to meet you," Martha said, shaking Anne's hand. "Come in, please. You're soaked. Let me make you some tea." Inside, the cottage was even cozier than usual. Anne had clearly been busy. There were flowers in vases, cushions that hadn't been there before, and the smell of something baking filled the air. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and Captain immediately headed toward it, shedding his rain jacket with an undignified shake and claiming the best chair. "I have a thick envelope for you," Martha said to Sam, pulling it from her waterproof bag. "Looks official." Sam opened it while Anne made tea. Inside were several documents, which Sam scanned quickly before looking up with excitement. "It's from the Historical Society," he explained. "They're interested in the lighthouse. They want to include it in a regional preservation project, maybe even help fund restoration work." "That's wonderful," Anne said, bringing over mugs of steaming tea. "You've been worried about the maintenance costs." They sat together by the fire, Martha and the Frost siblings, while the storm built outside and Captain purred from his chair. Anne told stories about her children, showed pictures on her phone of Sam's niece and nephew. Sam talked about his life in Harbor Point, about giving tours of the lighthouse in summer, about the peace he'd found here. "I was angry with him for so long," Anne said quietly, looking at her brother. "When he left the city, left his job, left everything, I thought he was throwing his life away." "I was, in a way, but I needed to. I was drowning in that life. Here, I could breathe again." "I understand that now." Anne reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry it took me 20 years to see it." Martha sipped her tea and felt like she was witnessing something important, a healing, a reconnection, the kind of thing that happened quietly in small moments but changed everything. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, two people who had been strangers for 2 decades were becoming family again. When Martha finally stood to leave, the rain had intensified even more. Anne pressed a container of fresh cookies into her hands. "For your route," she said, and Sam walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. The mail, the coffee, the friendship. You were the first person in Harbor Point who made me feel welcome. I never forgot that." Martha felt her throat tighten. "You're welcome here, Sam. You always have been." Captain, who had thoroughly dried himself by the fire, consented to put his rain jacket back on, and they headed out into the weather. The wind had picked up significantly, and Martha had to lean into it as they descended the rocky path. Waves crashed against the cliffs below with tremendous force, sending spray high into the air. The fog was so thick now that Martha could barely see 10 feet ahead. But Captain knew the way, and Martha trusted him. Step by careful step, they made their way back down to town. Harbor Point looked deserted. Everyone with any sense was inside, waiting out the storm. The shops on Main Street were closed, their windows dark. Only the Mermaid Cafe showed any signs of life, and even there, the outdoor tables had been stacked and stored away. Martha had one more delivery to make, the postcard for Rachel Kim at the Harborview Inn. The inn was a 3-story Victorian building that had been converted to a bed and breakfast 20 years ago. It sat on a hill overlooking the harbor, painted pale yellow with white trim, and a wraparound porch that offered views of the water. In good weather, it was charming. In this weather, it looked windswept and lonely. Martha climbed the porch steps, Captain at her heels, and rang the bell. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Mrs. Patterson, who owned the inn and ran it with cheerful efficiency. "Martha, Captain, come in, come in. What are you doing out in this weather?" Mail delivery doesn't stop for rain, though she was grateful to step into the warm, dry entryway. The inn smelled of cinnamon and apples. Mrs. Patterson must have been baking. "You're dedicated, I'll give you that. Who's the delivery for?" "Rachel Kim, I'm not sure which room. She's in the blue room, 3rd floor, but she's not here right now. Went out this morning before the rain got bad, said she was going to the cannery one more time before the town council made their decision." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "I tried to tell her a storm was coming, but she said she wouldn't be long." Martha felt a prickle of concern. "That was this morning? What time?" "Around 8:30. It was now almost noon. The storm had been building for hours. If Rachel was still at the cannery— "I'll drop the postcard off later," Martha said, already turning toward the door. "Mrs. Patterson, if she comes back, could you call me?" "Of course, dear. Is everything all right?" But Martha was already heading back into the rain, Captain trotting beside her, both of them moving with purpose now. The cannery wasn't far, 10 minutes in good weather, maybe 15 in this storm. But Martha's mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. An old building in a storm, loose boards, weak floors, broken windows, someone who didn't know the building's dangers, who was focused on documenting it, who might not have noticed when the weather turned serious. They reached the cannery to find the side door standing open, banging against its frame in the wind. Martha's concern deepened to real worry. "Rachel?" she called, stepping inside. "Rachel Kim?" No answer, just the sound of wind howling through broken windows and rain drumming on the roof high above. Captain moved ahead, his wet paws silent on the concrete floor. Martha followed, calling Rachel's name again. The building creaked and groaned around them, the storm testing its old bones. Water was coming in through the broken windows, creating puddles on the floor, making everything slippery. They moved through the main floor, then toward the corridor where Chief Morrison had gotten trapped. Martha checked each office, each room, finding them all empty. She was beginning to think maybe Rachel had left hours ago, had gone somewhere else, was safe and dry and laughing at the Mermaid Cafe with Joe Chen. Then Captain stopped at the base of a stairwell Martha hadn't noticed before. The stairs led up to what must have been the administrative offices on the 2nd floor. The cat sat down and looked up at her, then looked up the stairs, then back at her. "Up there?" Martha asked. Captain meowed, a sound that was almost urgent. Martha tested the first step. It held. Tested the second, also solid. The handrail was loose but still attached. She started climbing, Captain right beside her, both of them moving carefully. The 2nd floor was in worse shape than the first. More of the windows were broken, letting in rain and wind. The floor had holes in places, gaps where boards had rotted through. Martha moved slowly, testing each step, staying close to the walls where the structure was likely to be the strongest. "Rachel?" she called again. This time she heard something, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Here! I'm here!" Martha followed the voice to the room at the far end of the corridor. The door was partially open, wedged against something. She pushed harder, and it gave way enough for her to slip through. Rachel Kim was sitting against the far wall, her right ankle at an awkward angle, her face pale. Her camera and sketchbook were scattered nearby, and her jacket was soaked through. "Martha," Rachel said, and her relief was palpable. "And Captain, thank God." Martha knelt beside her, already assessing the situation. "Your ankle?" "I think it's broken. I was photographing the upper floor, got focused on my architectural details, didn't notice how bad the storm was getting. Started to leave, missed a step in the stairwell, fell." She grimaced. "My phone went flying, landed somewhere I can't reach. I've been calling for help, but no one could hear me over the storm." Captain walked over and gently headbutted Rachel's hand, purring. Even in pain, Rachel managed to smile and pet him. "How long have you been here?" Martha asked. "Since about 9:30. I'm so cold." 3 hours. Martha pulled off her own waterproof jacket and draped it over Rachel, then pulled out her phone. No signal. The metal structure and the storm were interfering. "Okay," Martha said, thinking fast. "We need to get you downstairs and out of this building. Can you stand at all?" Rachel tried and went white with pain. "I don't think so." Martha looked around the room, at Captain, at the rain pouring through the broken windows. She couldn't carry Rachel down the stairs. The woman was too heavy and the stairs too dangerous. She couldn't leave her here while she went for help. Rachel was hypothermic, needed medical attention soon. She needed to think like a mail carrier. Problem: get a message to people who can help. Solution: send the message. She looked at Captain, who was watching her with those intelligent amber eyes. "Captain," she said slowly, "I need you to do something important. Can you go find Chief Morrison or Joe Chen, anyone who can help?" The cat looked at her, looked at Rachel, then stood and walked to the door. He paused there, looked back once more, then disappeared into the corridor. She had no idea if he understood, if he would actually go find help, if cats even worked that way. But she'd seen Captain do remarkable things over the years, and right now she had to believe. "He's gone for help," she told Rachel, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "That's a very smart cat," Rachel said, her words slightly slurred from cold and pain. "He is." Martha sat beside Rachel, pulling the younger woman close to share body heat. "Tell me about your research. Tell me why you're so interested in old canneries." Rachel leaned against her gratefully. "My grandmother worked in one. Not this one, a different one down in Gloucester. She told me stories about it when I was little, the women who worked there, the community they built, how hard the work was, but how proud of it they were." She paused, shivering. "These buildings aren't just structures, they're stories, they're lives, they're—" She trailed off. "Stay with me," Martha said firmly. "Keep talking. What else did your grandmother tell you?" Rachel talked, her voice getting weaker but steady enough. Martha listened and encouraged and kept her talking, all while listening for sounds of rescue. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Rain poured through the windows. The building creaked ominously. 15 minutes passed, 20, 30. Then Martha heard it, voices from below, footsteps on the stairs, careful but quick. "Up here! Second floor, end of the corridor." Chief Morrison appeared first, followed by Joe Chen and Mr. Kowalski, and bringing up the rear, looking extremely pleased with himself, was Captain. "The cat came to the station," the chief said, already assessing Rachel's injury, "scratched at the door until I opened it, then wouldn't leave me alone, kept pulling at my pant leg, leading me toward the cannery. I finally followed him." "Same with me," Joe said. "Showed up at the cafe making a fuss. I thought something was wrong with Martha. Found me at the docks. Smart animal," Mr. Kowalski added. They splinted Rachel's ankle using boards from the cannery and the first aid kit from the chief's car, then carefully carried her down the stairs and out to the patrol car. An ambulance was already on its way, called by Mrs. Patterson at the inn, who'd grown worried when Rachel didn't return. By the time they got Rachel settled and the ambulance had taken her to the hospital in the next town over, the storm was finally beginning to ease. The rain was still falling, but the wind had died down and there were even hints of lighter sky on the horizon. Chief Morrison looked at Captain, who was sitting on the hood of the patrol car again, looking remarkably dry for an animal who had been running through a storm. "That cat," the chief said, shaking his head in wonder, "is something special." "He really is," Martha agreed, picking Captain up and holding him close. He purred against her chest, content and warm. "He really is." They stood there for a moment, the small group of them, looking at the old cannery. It had nearly claimed another victim today, but it hadn't, because of a cat who understood that sometimes the most important deliveries weren't letters or packages. Sometimes they were messages of help, carried through four paws through a storm, delivered to the exact right people at the exact right time. Joe Chen cleared his throat. Anyone else feel like they could use some hot coffee and pie? On the house. They all agreed that sounded perfect. At the Mermaid Cafe, with the storm finally breaking outside and comfort food warming them from the inside, Martha sat with Captain on her lap and thought about the day, about Sam Frost and his sister reuniting, about Rachel Kim and her dedication to preserving history, about how a small coastal town took care of its own, even when its own was someone who had only been there a few days. Mrs. Patterson came in, having heard about the rescue, and brought news that Rachel was going to be fine. Broken ankle, some bruising, but nothing that wouldn't heal. She wants to thank Captain personally, she said, smiling at the cat. Said to tell him he's a hero. Captain, full of bacon that Joe had slipped him, merely yawned and settled deeper into Martha's lap. Heroes, apparently, needed their rest. By the time Martha got home that evening, the rain had stopped completely and stars were beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. Her house was warm and dry, and she made herself a simple dinner and sat by the window, watching Harbor Point settle into its evening routines. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant no mail delivery, but Martha knew that Monday she and Captain would be back at it, making their rounds, connecting the town one delivery at a time. She thought about Anne Frost's words at the lighthouse, "I'm sorry it took me 20 years to see it." Sometimes understanding comes slowly. Sometimes it takes a storm to show you what mattered. Sometimes it takes a cat leading you through the rain to understand that connection, real, deep connection, was worth any amount of effort. Martha finished her dinner, washed her dishes, and went to bed early. Outside, Harbor Point slept under clearing skies. The storm passed, the community stronger for having weathered it together. And somewhere in the darkness, an orange and white cat curled up in his chosen spot, dreaming whatever cats dream, knowing that Monday would bring new routes, new deliveries, new opportunities to be exactly what he was, Harbor Point's most dedicated postal worker. 4 paws, 1 mission, keep the town connected, no matter what. The week after the storm brought the kind of weather that made people remember why they loved autumn in Maine. The skies were impossibly blue, the air crisp and clean, with just enough chill to make sweaters necessary, but not so cold that you couldn't spend hours outdoors. The leaves on Harbor Point's few deciduous trees reached their peak color, brilliant reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows that seemed to glow in the slanting autumn light. The ocean settled into a calmer rhythm, its waves gentle and almost playful after the fury of the storm. Captain seemed to appreciate the change. On Monday morning, he was waiting on the post office porch as always, but there was an extra spring in his step, a brightness to his eyes that suggested he was looking forward to their rounds even more than usual. "Good morning, hero," Martha said, unlocking the door. The title had stuck after Captain's rescue of Rachel Kim, and the cat seemed to accept it as simply another truth about himself, like his orange and white coloring or his preference for tuna over chicken. Inside, there was more mail than usual. The storm had delayed several deliveries, and now everything was arriving at once. Martha sorted through it methodically, packages for the Bishops and Mrs. Chen, a stack of letters for Eleanor Henderson, something official-looking for the town hall, and a surprising number of items for Sam Frost at the lighthouse. Apparently, word of his reconciliation with his sister had spread, and other family members were reaching out. But the item that caught Martha's attention was a large envelope addressed to Rachel Kim, care of Harbor Point General Delivery. It was from an architecture firm in Boston, and it was marked time sensitive. Rachel had been released from the hospital the day after her rescue, her ankle set in a cast, and strict instructions to stay off it for at least 6 weeks. She was still at the Harborview Inn, where Mrs. Patterson had moved her to a ground-floor room and was taking care of her with the fierce protectiveness of a mother hen. Martha loaded everything into her bag, and she and Captain set out into the perfect autumn morning. The town looked scrubbed clean by the storm, the colors more vivid, the air filled with the scent of salt and fallen leaves and wood smoke from morning fires. Their first stop was the Hendersons' house, where Eleanor was on the porch sweeping away the last remnants of leaves and debris from the storm. "Martha, Captain!" She set aside her broom and came down the steps, her movements slower than they used to be, but still purposeful. "I was hoping to catch you. I wanted to hear all about the rescue. Is it true Captain ran through the storm to get help?" "It's true," Martha said, handing over the stack of letters. "He went to Chief Morrison, then to Joe Chen, then to Stan Kowalski, led them all back to the cannery." Eleanor bent down to pet Captain, who accepted his admiration with his usual grace. "You're remarkable, you know that? Just remarkable." She straightened, looking at the letters in her hand. "Oh my, this is from my cousin in Chicago, and this one's from my niece in Seattle, and goodness, this is from Thomas's commanding officer. Good news, I hope?" Eleanor opened it right there, her hands trembling slightly. As she read, her face transformed, years seeming to fall away as joy replaced worry. "They're giving him a commendation," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for his work overseas. They're having a ceremony when he comes home, right here in Harbor Point. They want to honor him in front of his community." She pressed the letter to her chest. "I'm so proud of him, so very proud." They talked about the ceremony for a few more minutes, about what Eleanor would wear, about how the whole town would turn out. By the time Martha and Captain left, Eleanor was already on her phone, calling relatives to share the news. Walking down Seaglass Lane, Captain suddenly veered toward a yard where Mrs. Bishop was working in her flower beds, preparing them for winter. "Captain!" Mrs. Bishop exclaimed, pulling off her gardening gloves. "And Martha, perfect timing. I wanted to show you something." She led them to the side of the house, where a small garden bed had been cleared and freshly planted. A handmade sign stuck in the ground read, "Rachel's Garden." "I felt so terrible about what happened to that poor girl, working so hard to preserve our history and then getting hurt. So I planted these spring bulbs for her. Daffodils and tulips and crocuses. They'll come up next April and May, a whole riot of color. I'm going to take pictures and send them to her wherever she ends up, so she'll know that Harbor Point is thinking of her." Martha felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was Harbor Point at its best. People caring for each other, creating beauty in response to pain, ensuring that no kindness went unanswered. They continued their route, stopping at house after house, each one bringing a new story, a new connection. At Mr. Kowalski's place, they found him teaching a young boy, his great-nephew visiting from Portland, how to mend the lobster trap. "Figure I should pass on what I know while I still can. Might not be much commercial fishing anymore, but the knowledge shouldn't die with my generation." At the bookshop, Mrs. Chen had set up a new display, Harbor Point History, featuring books about coastal Maine, fishing traditions, and industrial architecture. A handwritten card explained that the display was inspired by Rachel Kim's research. "She came by on crutches yesterday, wanted to thank me for the books I'd recommended. We talked for over an hour about her project. She's going to feature Harbor Point's cannery in her dissertation, said it's one of the best preserved examples she's found." Joe Chen at the Mermaid Cafe had created a new menu item, Captain Storm Special, a hearty seafood chowder with fresh-baked bread, perfect for cold autumn days. A percentage of the proceeds would go to the Historical Society's Preservation Fund. "That cat brought the whole town together during the storm," Joe explained, sliding a piece of bacon to Captain, who accepted it with dignified pleasure. Seemed right to honor him somehow. Everywhere they went, Martha saw evidence of the storm's aftermath, not destruction, but connection. People were reaching out more, checking on neighbors, sharing stories, building community in ways both large and small. It was as if the storm had reminded everyone what mattered, and they were determined not to forget. By the time they reached the path to the lighthouse, it was mid-morning, and the sun was warm on Martha's shoulders. Captain bounded ahead, as energetic as ever, pausing occasionally to investigate interesting scents or watch seabirds wheeling overhead. At the lighthouse cottage, they found both Sam and Anne working in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard frost arrived. Anne had extended her visit indefinitely, and Sam seemed lighter, happier, more present than Martha had ever seen him. "Martha, Captain," Anne called, straightening and waving. "We were just talking about you." Sam came over, wiping dirt from his hands. "We've been making plans. The Historical Society grant came through. Did you see the letter?" "I delivered it, didn't read it," Martha said with a smile.
They're funding a full restoration of the lighthouse, new paint, structural repairs, even restoring the light mechanism. It won't be operational for navigation, but it'll work for tours and events. Sam's excitement was palpable, and Anne's agreed to help. She's going to spend summers here, help me run educational programs for kids about lighthouse keeping and maritime history. "We're going to reconnect our family with this place," Anne added. "My kids are already excited. They want to come for Christmas, see the lighthouse in winter." They invited Martha in for coffee, but she begged off. She still had deliveries to make, including Rachel's time-sensitive envelope. But she left with a container of fresh vegetables from their garden and a warmth in her heart that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. The Harbor View Inn sat on its hill like always, but today it seemed more welcoming, its yellow paint bright against the blue sky, its porch inviting with comfortable chairs and blankets for guests who wanted to enjoy the view. Mrs. Patterson answered the door, flour on her apron and a smile on her face. "Martha, Captain, come in, come in. Rachel's in the sunroom, working on her laptop. She'll be so happy to see you both." The sunroom was at the back of the inn, a glassed-in space that overlooked the harbor and caught the southern light. Rachel Kim sat in a comfortable chair, her casted foot propped up on an ottoman, her laptop balanced on her knees. Papers and photographs were spread on the table beside her, and she was so focused on her work that she didn't hear them approach until Captain jumped onto the ottoman beside her foot. "Captain!" Rachel's face lit up. She set aside her laptop and gathered the cat into her arms, burying her face in his fur. "My hero, my four-legged furry hero." Captain purred loudly, clearly pleased with this greeting. "And Anne," Rachel reached out to squeeze Martha's hand, "I never properly thanked you. If you and Captain hadn't come looking for me—" "We're just glad you're okay," Martha said. "I have a delivery for you. Looks important." Rachel opened the envelope from the Boston architecture firm, her eyes scanning the letter quickly. Her expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to joy. "They want to hire me," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Full-time position starting in January. Research and preservation specialist for historical industrial sites throughout New England." She looked up at Martha, eyes shining. "This is my dream job. This is exactly what I've been working toward." "That's wonderful, Rachel." "It is. It really is." But Rachel's joy seemed tempered by something. Regret, maybe, or sadness. She looked out the window at Harbor Point spread below, the harbor with its fishing boats, the town with its weathered buildings, the ocean beyond. "I've only been here 2 weeks, and I'm going to miss this place. Does that sound crazy?" "Not at all," Martha said. "Harbor Point has a way of getting into your heart." They talked for a while longer, Rachel sharing her plans for the dissertation that would become a book, Martha telling her about Mrs. Bishop's garden and the bookshop display. Captain alternated between purring on Rachel's lap and investigating the sunroom's interesting corners. When Martha finally stood to leave, Rachel caught her hand. "Will you tell everyone thank you?" she asked. "The whole town, for accepting me, for caring when I got hurt, for making me feel like I belonged even though I was just passing through. You can tell them yourself, Martha said. At the ceremony for Eleanor Henderson's grandson, the whole town will be there, and you're invited. I'd like that, Rachel said softly. I'd really like that. Martha and Captain left the inn and made their way back to town for their afternoon deliveries. The sun was high now, the day warm enough that Martha unzipped her jacket. Captain seemed content to amble along at a slower pace, occasionally stopping to watch a butterfly or investigate a particularly interesting leaf. When they were passing the old cannery, when Chief Morrison's patrol car pulled up beside them. "Martha, Captain," the chief said through the open window. "Got a minute?" They walked over and the chief got out of the car, looking at the cannery with an expression Martha couldn't quite read. "Town council met last night and made a decision about the building. They're going to preserve it, turn it into a community center and museum. Rachel Kim's research convinced them it's worth saving." He paused. "Going to take years and a lot of money, but they're committed. Even got a developer interested in doing it right, preserving the historical elements." Martha looked at the old brick building with new eyes, not a monument to decay, but a promise of renewal. Not an ending, but a beginning. "That's good news," she said. "It is." The chief looked at Captain. "That cat of yours has good instincts. If he hadn't led us to Rachel, if she hadn't been here doing her research, the council probably would have voted to demolish. Sometimes it takes an outsider to help us see what we've got." He drove off and Martha and Captain continued their route, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through Main Street. At the post office, Sarah was waiting with a message. "Sam Frost called," she said, "asked if you and Captain could come to a dinner at the lighthouse this Saturday. He's inviting several people, wants to celebrate his sister's visit and the restoration grant. He was very specific that Captain had to come too." Martha smiled. "Tell him we'd be honored." That evening, as Martha sat in her kitchen preparing dinner, she found herself thinking about connections, how they formed, how they strengthened, how they endured. Rachel Kim had come to Harbor Point as a stranger, focused on buildings and history, but in 2 weeks she'd become part of the community story, and the community had become part of hers. Sam Frost had spent 3 years keeping people at a distance, living with his regrets and his solitude. Then one letter opened a door, and now he was surrounded by family and plans and purpose. Eleanor Henderson had worried alone about her grandson for 2 years. Now the whole town would celebrate his homecoming, his honor, his service. And through it all, a mail carrier and a cat had walked their route, delivering more than letters, carrying more than packages. They'd carried connection itself, the invisible threads that bound Harbor Point together. Martha's phone rang. It was Mrs. Chen from the bookshop. "Is that Martha? I hope I'm not calling too late. I just wanted to let you know I'm organizing a book club, and our first selection is going to be about lighthouse keeping. Sam Frost agreed to guest lecture at our first meeting. I thought you might like to join us." "I'd love to," Martha said. After they hung up, Martha looked out her window at Harbor Point settling into evening. Lights were coming on in houses, smoke was rising from chimneys, and somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary sounds, ordinary sights, but threaded through with something extraordinary. The care people took with each other, the way they showed up, the small kindnesses that accumulated into something larger than any individual act. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, sunny, cool, with a breeze that carried the scent of the ocean and wood smoke. Martha put on her favorite sweater, the blue one Eleanor Henderson knit for her birthday 3 years ago, and walked to the lighthouse with Captain at her side. The path was easier than usual. Sam had cleared away loose rocks and trimmed back the overgrown brush, making it safer for his sister and future visitors. As they climbed, Martha could see other people making the same journey. Joe Chen with a covered dish, Mrs. Patterson carrying what looked like a pie, Chief Morrison and his wife Helen, the bishops, Mrs. Chen with her son. The lighthouse cottage had been transformed. Tables were set up outside, taking advantage of the beautiful weather. White lights were strung between posts, ready to be lit as evening fell.
The smell of grilling food filled the air, and music played softly from speakers Sam had set up. Sam and Anne greeted everyone as they arrived, both of them glowing with happiness. Anne's children were there too, teenagers who looked slightly overwhelmed by the attention but pleased to be included. They immediately gravitated toward Captain, who accepted their adoration with his usual grace. As the afternoon turned to evening, people ate and talked and laughed. Joe had brought his famous lobster rolls, Mrs. Patterson contributed apple pies made from her own trees, and Sam grilled corn and vegetables from his garden. Someone had brought wine, someone else had made brownies, and the food kept appearing as if by magic. Stories were told about the storm, about Harbor Point's history, about the fishing industry's glory days and its decline. Anne talked about her life in the city, her children's activities, her work as a teacher. Sam shared his plans for the lighthouse, for educational programs and summer tours. And throughout it all, Captain moved from person to person, receiving pets and treats, purring and being generally magnificent. The teenagers took dozens of photos of him, declaring him the most photogenic cat ever. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sam stood and tapped his glass for attention. "I want to thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. 3 years ago, I came to Harbor Point running from my past, convinced I needed to be alone. You welcomed me anyway. You gave me work, gave me friendship, gave me community. And when I needed it most, you gave me the courage to reconnect with my family. He looked at Anne, who was wiping tears from her eyes. My sister and I lost 20 years because we couldn't see past our differences. But Harbor Point taught me that connection is worth the risk, that community matters, that we're all stronger together than apart. He raised his glass. To Harbor Point, to second chances, to family, both the one you're born with and the one you choose. Everyone raised their glasses, and there wasn't a dry eye in the group. As darkness fell and the white lights came on, creating a warm glow against the night, people began sharing their own stories. Eleanor Henderson talked about Thomas's upcoming homecoming. Mrs. Chen announced the new book club. The Bishops revealed they were starting a community garden next spring, open to anyone who wanted to participate. And Rachel Kim, who had arrived on crutches with Mrs. Patterson's help, announced that even though she'd be starting her new job in Boston, she planned to spend summers in Harbor Point, continuing her research and maybe teaching workshops on historical preservation. "You've given me so much," she said, looking around at the gathered faces. "You took me in when I was a stranger, saved me when I was in trouble, and showed me what real community looks like. Harbor Point will always be in my research, but more importantly, it'll always be in my heart." Martha sat with Captain on her lap, listening to these stories, watching these connections form and strengthen. She thought about 32 years of walking the same routes, delivering the same kind of mail, seeing the same faces. It could have become routine, could have felt small or insignificant, but it wasn't. It never had been. Every letter she delivered carried someone's words, someone's thoughts, someone's love across distance. Every package held a gift, a memory, a connection maintained. Every day, she and Captain walked through Harbor Point, and every day they helped weave the invisible net that held the community together. Joe Chen came over and sat beside her, pressing a cup of hot cider into her hands. "You know what I think?" he said, watching Captain receive attention from yet another admirer. "What's that?" "I think that cat understands something most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out." "What's that?" "That showing up matters, that consistency matters, that being present for people day after day, whether the sun's shining or the storm's raging, that's what builds a life worth living." Martha sipped her cider and thought about that. Captain wasn't special because he could do extraordinary things, though his rescue of Rachel was remarkable. He was special because he showed up every single day, rain or shine, and did the ordinary work of being present, of witnessing people's lives, of connecting. Just like she did, just like everyone here did in their own ways. The party continued late into the evening. At some point, someone produced a guitar and soft music filled the air. People danced slowly on the grass, couples swaying together, children running around with flashlights creating patterns in the darkness. Martha sat with Captain and watched Harbor Point at its best. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and caring and committed to each other. A small town on the Maine coast where everyone knew everyone, where a mail carrier and a cat could become the threads that held it all together, where strangers could become family and broken relationships could heal. When Martha finally headed home, the moon was high and full, casting silver light across the ocean. Captain walked beside her, unusually quiet, as if he too was processing the evening's emotions. At her house, Martha paused before going inside. She looked back toward the lighthouse, which was lit up like a beacon, the party still going strong. She could hear distant laughter, see the white lights twinkling in the darkness. Tomorrow was Sunday, a day off, but Monday would come, and with it the routine, the mail to sort, the routes to walk, the connections to maintain. It would be ordinary, unremarkable, the same thing she'd done thousands of times before. And it would be everything. Because that's what life was, really. Not the big moments, though those mattered, but the small ones, accumulated over time, building into something larger than any individual day. The smile when you delivered good news, the concern when someone was hurt, the celebration when something went right, the support when things went wrong. Connection, maintained one delivery at a time. Martha went inside, Captain following, both of them content and tired and ready for rest. Outside, Harbor Point slept under the autumn moon, its people dreaming their individual dreams, but bound together by invisible threads of care and community and commitment. And somewhere in those dreams, an orange and white cat walked his routes, delivered his messages, and reminded everyone that showing up day after day, storm after storm, was the most heroic thing anyone could do.
November arrived in Harbor Point with the kind of quiet determination that characterized the town itself. The autumn colors faded, leaving behind bare branches that scratched against gray skies. The temperature dropped steadily, requiring heavier coats and warmer gloves. The ocean took on a darker hue, slate blue instead of the summer's bright aquamarine, and the waves grew more assertive, reminding everyone that winter was coming and it would not be denied. But there was warmth too, the kind that came from knowing the holidays were approaching. Thanksgiving decorations appeared on porches, wreaths made of dried corn and gourds, scarecrows propped against railings, baskets of colorful mums. Mrs. Patterson at the Harborview Inn hung a banner welcoming guests to Harbor Point's coziest season, and Joe Chen at the Mermaid Cafe added pumpkin pie and hot apple cider to his menu. And through it all, Martha and Captain continued their rounds, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their routine as steady as the tides. The morning of November 15th dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on windows and making the grass crunch underfoot. Martha arrived at the post office extra early, knowing that today was special. Thomas Anderson was coming home. Captain was already waiting, sitting on the porch railing with unusual stillness, as if he too understood the significance of the day. When Martha opened the door, he followed her inside and watched as she sorted the morning's mail with particular care. There wasn't much, a few letters, some bills, a package for Mrs. Chen,
But there was one item that mattered more than all the others combined, a large envelope from the Department of Defense addressed to Eleanor Henderson. Martha knew what it contained, the official commendation for Thomas, along with details about this afternoon's ceremony. She loaded everything into her bag, bundled herself in her warmest jacket, and set out with Captain into the frosty morning. The town was just waking up, but already there were signs of preparation. Main Street had been swept clean, American flags had been hung from lamp posts, and someone, probably the town council, had erected a small stage in the town square where the ceremony would take place. Their first stop, as always, was the Hendersons' house. But today, Eleanor wasn't on the porch waiting. Instead, the door flew open before Martha could even start up the steps, and Eleanor stood there in her bathrobe, her face radiant with joy and anticipation. "He's here," she said, her voice trembling. "Thomas arrived last night, wanted to surprise me. He's upstairs sleeping now, but Martha, he's home. He's really home." Martha handed over the envelope, and Eleanor clutched it to her chest. "The ceremony's at 2 o'clock. The whole town's planning to be there." "I can't believe it. I never thought—" Eleanor's voice broke and she wiped at her eyes. "I never thought I'd see the day when the whole town would turn out to honor my grandson." Captain jumped onto the porch railing and meowed softly, and Eleanor laughed through her tears. "You'll be there too, won't you, Captain? You and Martha both." "We wouldn't miss it," Martha promised. They continued their route through a town that was clearly preparing for something important. At the bookshop, Mrs. Chin was arranging a display of books about military service and homecoming. At the Mermaid Cafe, Joe was preparing extra food for the reception that would follow the ceremony. The bishops were hanging more flags, and Mr. Kowalski was polishing his old Navy uniform, planning to wear it in solidarity. By the time Martha and Captain reached the lighthouse, the sun had burned off the early frost and the day had turned beautiful, cold but brilliantly clear, with visibility stretching for miles across the ocean. Sam and Anne were both outside, working on the final preparations for the lighthouse's official reopening, scheduled for the day after Thanksgiving. The restoration work was nearly complete, and the lighthouse looked magnificent, freshly painted, structurally sound, ready to begin its new life as an educational center and community gathering space. "Big day," Sam said, coming over to greet them, "for Thomas, for Eleanor, for the whole town." "Will you both be at the ceremony?" Martha asked. "Of course," Anne said. "We wouldn't miss it. Sam's even going to say a few words. The mayor asked him to speak about service and community." Sam looked embarrassed but pleased. "I'm not much of a public speaker." "You'll be fine," Martha assured him. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants." They chatted for a few more minutes about the lighthouse reopening, about Anne's plans to bring her whole extended family for Thanksgiving, about the future and all the possibilities it held. Then Martha and Captain headed back down to town, the morning's deliveries complete, the afternoon's ceremony drawing closer. At home, Martha changed into her best clothes, a dark blue dress that Eleanor had helped her pick out years ago, her good coat, her warmest scarf. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman that spent 32 years walking the same streets, delivering the same kind of mail, being part of the same small community. Some might have called it a small life, an unremarkable life. But Martha knew better. She'd witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, connections made and relationships healed. She'd been present for thousands of small moments that, taken together, made up the fabric of Harbor Point's life. That wasn't small. That was everything. She walked back to town, arriving at the square just before 2 o'clock. The entire population of Harbor Point seemed to be there, maybe 300 people, all bundled in winter coats, all facing the small stage where the mayor stood with Chief Morrison, Sam Frost, and several other town dignitaries. and in the front row, seated in a place of honor, was Eleanor Henderson. Beside her sat a young man in his marine dress uniform, his posture military straight, his face showing the kind of quiet strength that came from having seen difficult things and emerged intact. Thomas Anderson was home. Martha found a spot near the back, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a family moment, but Captain had other ideas. The cat slipped through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd spent years navigating packed spaces, and before Martha could stop him, he jumped onto the stage and sat down next to the mayor, looking out at the assembled crowd as if he belonged there, which, Martha realized, he absolutely did. The mayor cleared his throat and began to speak, his words carrying across the quiet square. "We're here today to honor one of our own. Thomas Anderson grew up in Harbor Point, played on these streets, went to school in that building right there, learned to fish from his great-uncle Stan Kowalski. When his country called, he answered. He served with distinction, with courage, and with the kind of quiet dedication that we've come to associate with the people of this town." The mayor paused, looking down at Thomas. But more than that, Thomas represents something important about Harbor Point itself. We're a small community, easy to overlook on a map, but we take care of our own. We show up for each other. We remember that every person matters, every service counts, every act of courage, whether in a foreign land or right here at home, deserves to be recognized. He held up the official commendation, read its formal language about Thomas's service and sacrifice, then handed it to Eleanor, who accepted it with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face. Then Sam Frost stepped forward to speak. "I've lived in Harbor Point for 3 years," he began, his voice steady despite his earlier nervousness. "Before that, I lived in a big city, had a career, was part of a different kind of life. I came here running from things I couldn't face, convinced that isolation was what I needed." He looked out at the crowd, his gaze touching on faces, Martha's, Ann's, Joe Chen's, Mrs. Patterson's. "Harbor Point taught me that I was wrong. Connection isn't a burden, it's what saves us. Community isn't something that holds us back, it's what helps us fly. And service, real service, the kind that Thomas has shown, the kind that so many of you show every single day, isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up, about being present, about doing what needs to be done even when no one's watching." He paused, looking down at Captain, who sat beside him, purring. "This town has a cat who delivers mail. Does that sound ridiculous? Maybe, but Captain understands something profound, that consistency matters, that presence matters, that the simple act of showing up day after day creates the threads that hold a community together." Sam looked directly at Thomas now. "Thank you for your service. Thank you for showing up when your country needed you, and thank you for coming home to us so we can show up for you." The crowd erupted in applause, and Thomas stood, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He hugged his grandmother, then turned to face the assembled townspeople. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice rougher than Sam's, carrying the weight of experiences most of the crowd couldn't imagine, "except that every day I was overseas, I thought about home, about this town, these streets, these people, about my grandmother's kitchen and Mr. Kowalski's fishing boat and the Mermaid Cafe's blueberry pancakes." Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. "Those memories kept me going when things got hard. The idea that there was a place where people knew my name, where I mattered, not because of what I could do, but because of who I was. That's what home means. That's what Harbor Point means." He looked around, taking in the flags, the gathered crowd, the town square where he'd played as a child. "So thank you, not just for this ceremony, but for being the kind of place worth coming home to."
The applause was thunderous now, and people surged forward to shake Thomas's hand, to hug Eleanor, to welcome the young Marine home properly. Captain jumped down from the stage and wound through the crowd, accepting pets and treats and admiration from dozens of hands. Martha stood back, watching it all, feeling the warmth of community wrap around her like a blanket. This was why she did what she did. This moment, this connection, this visible proof that small acts of service, whether in uniform overseas or in a mail carrier's bag at home, created something larger than any individual could achieve alone. The reception afterwards was held at the Mermaid Cafe, which Joe had closed to regular customers for the occasion. Food covered every available surface: lobster rolls and clam chowder, apple pie and pumpkin bread, coffee and cider, and enough sweets to satisfy everyone's autumn cravings. People ate and talked and laughed, the warmth inside the cafe a stark contrast to the cold November air outside. Thomas was surrounded by well-wishers, but he kept looking around as if making sure everything was real, that he was truly home. Martha found herself standing next to Rachel Kim, who'd driven up from Boston specifically for the ceremony. Her cast was off now, replaced by a walking boot, and she moved with only a slight limp. "I couldn't miss this," Rachel said, sipping hot cider. "After everything this town did for me, I needed to be here for something important. It means a lot that you came." "Harbor Point changed my life, you know." Rachel looked around the packed cafe at the people who'd welcomed her, saved her, made her feel like she belonged. "I start my new job next month, but I've already made arrangements to spend next summer here working on my research. Mrs. Patterson's holding a room for me." "That's wonderful." "It is," Rachel smiled. "I've lived in a lot of places, Martha, but I've never felt at home the way I do here. Even though I was only here for a few weeks, even though I'm not from here, Harbor Point feels like where I belong." I understood completely. She'd been born in Harbor Point, had lived here her entire life, but she knew people who'd arrived just last year and already felt like locals. It wasn't about time, it was about connection, about finding the place where your presence mattered, where people noticed when you were there and missed you when you weren't. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, people gradually drifted out of the cafe and back to their homes, but there was a reluctance to let the day end, as if everyone wanted to hold on to this feeling just a little longer, the warmth, the connection, the sense of being part of something meaningful. Martha was getting ready to leave when Eleanor Henderson approached, Thomas beside her. "Martha," Eleanor said, taking her hand, "I wanted Thomas to meet you properly. You've been delivering mail to my house for 20 years, and every single one of those deliveries mattered. Every letter from Thomas, every postcard, every package. You brought them to me with care, with kindness. You connected us when distance tried to separate us." Thomas extended his hand and Martha shook it, feeling the strength in his grip, the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder experiences. "My grandmother talks about you all the time, you and Captain. She says you're the heart of this town." "I just deliver mail," Martha protested. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "You deliver so much more than that. You deliver hope and connection and community. You remind us that we're not alone, that we matter to each other. Don't underestimate what that means." Martha's throat tightened with emotion. After 32 years, she thought she understood her job, but hearing it put this way, seeing how her daily routine had touched people's lives in ways she'd never fully appreciated, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. She walked home as dusk settled over Harbor Point, Captain trotting beside her, both of them tired but content. The town was quiet now, people settling into their evening routines, but there was a different quality to the silence. It felt fuller somehow, richer, as if the day's ceremony had added another layer to the community's foundation. At home, Martha made herself a simple dinner and sat by the window, watching the lights come on across Harbor Point. She thought about Thomas, about how he'd crossed an ocean and a continent to come home to this small town. She thought about Rachel, who'd found belonging in just a few weeks. She thought about Sam and Anne, rebuilding their relationship one day at a time. She thought about all the letters she'd delivered, all the connections she'd facilitated, all the small moments that had accumulated into this larger story of community. Her phone rang. It was the mayor. "Martha, hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to let you know the town council met this evening. We're creating a new position, community coordinator, someone to help organize events, maintain connections, support new residents in getting integrated into town life, and we want you to consider it." Martha was stunned. "Me? But I'm a mail carrier. That's what I do." "You'd still deliver mail," the mayor assured her. "We're not asking you to give that up, but you have 32 years of experience connecting this community. You know everyone, understand what matters to people, see the town in a way most of us don't. We need that perspective. We need your expertise." "Can I think about it?"
Of course, take your time. But Martha, you've been doing this job unofficially for years. We just want to recognize it, support it, make it official. After they hung up, Martha sat in the darkness, processing. A new role, new responsibilities, new ways to serve. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to keep things exactly as they were. Change was scary, even when it was good. But another part of her, the part that had spent 3 decades watching Harbor Point evolve, seeing people come and go, witnessing the constant dance of connection and community, that part was excited. This was an opportunity to do more of what she loved, to strengthen the threads that held the town together, to ensure that Harbor Point's unique character endured. She'd sleep on it, talk to Eleanor, to Sam, to Joe, get their perspectives, but already she knew what her answer would be. Yes, because saying yes meant embracing the future while honoring the past. It meant recognizing that communities evolved, but their core values, caring, connection, presence, remained constant. It meant understanding that her work with Captain wasn't just about delivering mail. It had never been just about delivering mail. It was about delivering home, one house at a time. The week between Thomas's ceremony and Thanksgiving passed in a blur of activity. Martha accepted the town council's offer, though she insisted on keeping her mail delivery route. That was non-negotiable. The council agreed readily, understanding that her daily rounds were the foundation of everything else she did. Rachel Kim returned to Boston, but called regularly with updates on her new job and questions about Harbor Point's history. Sam and Anne finished the lighthouse restoration and began planning their educational programs for the next summer. Mrs. Chen's book club held its first meeting with 20 people crowded into the bookshop's back room to discuss maritime history and eat Mrs. Patterson's cookies. And through it all, Martha and Captain walked their routes, delivered their mail, and watched Harbor Point prepare for the holidays with the kind of quiet enthusiasm that characterized the town. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear, with a light dusting of snow that had fallen overnight, the season's first. Martha woke early, as always, and looked out at Harbor Point transformed by that thin white blanket. Everything looked fresh, clean, new. There was no mail delivery today, but Martha had somewhere important to be. The town was gathering at the lighthouse for the official reopening ceremony, followed by a community Thanksgiving dinner. Sam and Anne had invited everyone, and the entire town had responded with enthusiasm. Martha dressed warmly, layers upon layers, her warmest coat, her favorite scarf, and walked to the lighthouse as the sun climbed higher. The path had been cleared of snow, made safe and accessible, and already Martha could see people making the climb. Families with children, elderly residents moving slowly but determinedly, young couples holding hands, everyone converging on the lighthouse that had stood watch over Harbor Point for more than a century. Captain met her at the base of the path, appearing from wherever he'd spent the night, and together they made the climb one more time. The lighthouse looked magnificent. Fresh white paint gleamed in the morning sun, the red cap bright as a cardinal against the pale sky. The keeper's cottage had been expanded slightly to accommodate a small museum and classroom space. Picnic tables and benches had been installed on the grounds, and someone, probably Mrs. Bishop, had planted winter flowers that somehow thrived despite the cold. But the most impressive change was at the top of the lighthouse itself. The light mechanism had been fully restored, and tonight, for the first time in 20 years, it would shine again. Not as a navigational aid, modern technology had made that unnecessary, but as a symbol, a beacon, a reminder that even in darkness, there was light. Sam stood near the lighthouse entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Anne was beside him, and their extended family surrounded them, children and cousins and siblings, all reunited, all present. The sight made Martha's heart swell. The ceremony was simple but moving. The mayor spoke briefly about the lighthouse's history, about its importance to Harbor Point's identity. Sam talked about preservation and community and the gift of second chances. Anne read a poem she'd written about lighthouses and homecoming that left half the crowd in tears. Then, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sam led everyone inside the lighthouse. The spiral stairs had been reinforced and fitted with better lighting, and the climb to the top was easier than it had been in years. Martha climbed with the others, Captain somehow managing to navigate the narrow stairs with typical feline grace. At the top, in the light room where the restored mechanism gleamed, everyone crowded together, looking out at the view. Harbor Point spread below them like a model village, the town square with its stage from Thomas's ceremony, Main Street with its shops and the Mermaid Cafe, the harbor with its fishing boats, the houses where everyone lived their interconnected lives. Beyond it all, the Atlantic Ocean stretched to the horizon, vast and eternal and beautiful. "This is what the lighthouse keeper saw," Sam said softly. "This is what they protected, not just ships, not just maritime traffic, but this, the town, the people, the community. That's what mattered. That's what still matters." As darkness fell, Sam activated the light mechanism. The great lens began to turn, and the beams swept out across the water, powerful and steady, visible for miles. Below, people cheered. From the town, car horns honked, and Captain, sitting on the windowsill of the light room, purred loudly enough to be heard over the celebration. The Thanksgiving dinner afterward was held in and around the keeper's cottage, with food spilling out onto the picnic tables, people eating standing up or sitting on the ground, everyone together in the cold November evening. Heaters had been set up and blankets were distributed, and somehow the cold became part of the experience, making the warmth of community feel even more precious. Martha found herself at a table with Eleanor and Thomas, Sam and Anne, Rachel Kim, who'd driven up that morning, Chief Morrison and his wife, Joe Chen and Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Patterson and the Bishops, Mr. Kowalski, and a dozen others. They ate turkey and stuffing, mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce, pies of every description. They talked and laughed and told stories. And in the middle of it all, Captain moved from person to person, accepting offerings of turkey and gentle pets, purring his contentment, reminding everyone that simple presence, just being there, just showing up, was often the greatest gift of all. As the evening wore on and people began to drift toward home, Martha stood with Sam at the edge of the lighthouse grounds, looking down at Harbor Point. The town was lit up now, every window glowing, the streets decorated with the first Christmas lights of the season. The lighthouse beams swept overhead, regular as a heartbeat, and the ocean murmured its eternal song against the rocks. "Thank you," Sam said quietly, "for everything. For being there from the beginning, for introducing me to the town, for showing me what community could be." "You did the work yourself," Martha said. "Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without guides. You and Captain, you showed me the way." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, then Sam spoke again. "Anne's moving here. Permanently. She's going to take early retirement from teaching, help me run the lighthouse programs full-time. Her kids are already looking at colleges in Maine. The whole family's coming home in a way." "That's wonderful, Sam." "It is, and it's because of Harbor Point, because of what this place represents: belonging, connection, home." He looked at Martha. "You've been creating that for 32 years, one delivery at a time. Do you understand how important that is?" Martha thought about it, really thought about it, perhaps for the first time. She'd spent 3 decades walking the same streets, seeing the same faces, delivering the same kind of mail. To an outsider, it might have looked monotonous, small, insignificant, but it wasn't. It had never been. Every letter she'd delivered had carried someone's words across distance. Every package had held a gift, a memory, a tangible piece of love. Every day she'd walked through Harbor Point and witnessed people's lives, their joys and sorrows, their beginnings and endings, their ordinary days and extraordinary moments. She hadn't just delivered mail, she'd delivered connection itself, the invisible force that transformed a collection of houses into a community, that turned strangers into neighbors, that made a small coastal town in Maine feel like the center of the universe to the people who lived there. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I do." They walked back down to town together, Sam and Anne, Martha and Captain, Eleanor and Thomas, Rachel and the Chens, all of them moving slowly through the cold November night. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, regular and reassuring, and the lights of Harbor Point beckoned them home. At her house, Martha said goodnight to everyone and went inside, Captain following. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window looking out at the town she loved, the community she'd helped nurture, the place that had been her home for 64 years. Her phone buzzed with messages, thank yous from the day, photos from the lighthouse ceremony, plans for Christmas events. She scrolled through them, smiling, feeling the warmth of connection even through the digital medium. Outside, the snow had started falling again, gentle flakes drifting down like blessings. Harbor Point was settling into sleep, its people safe and warm in their homes, connected by invisible threads of care and community and commitment. And in the morning, Martha and Captain would wake up and do it all again, sort the mail, walk the routes, deliver the letters and packages and connection that held the town together. It was ordinary work, unremarkable work, the kind of work that most people never noticed or thought about. But it was everything.
Because in the end, that's what life was. Not the grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the accumulation of ordinary days lived with intention and care. The commitment to show up, to be present, to maintain the connections that made life worth living. Martha finished her tea, checked to make sure Captain was settled in his favorite chair, and went to bed. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the harbor, across the ocean, across the darkness. A beacon, a promise, a reminder. You are not alone. You are seen. You matter. In a small coastal town in Maine where the ocean whispered secrets to the rocks and a cat helped deliver the mail, that promise was kept every single day. One delivery at a time, one connection at a time, one home at a time. Harbor Point endured not because it was perfect, but because its people chose to show up for each other, to witness each other's lives, to maintain the threads that bound them together. And at the heart of it all was a mail carrier and a cat who understood something profound, that the most important things we deliver aren't made of paper or cardboard. They're made of presence, of consistency, of care. They're made of connection, and connection, in the end, is what makes any place feel like home. The snow continued to fall as Harbor Point slept, blanketing the town in white, softening its edges, making everything clean and new. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities for connection. But tonight, there was just peace and gratitude and the quiet certainty that comes from being exactly where you belong, surrounded by people who see you, who know you, who choose you every single day. In the darkness, Captain stretched and purred, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new routes to walk, new deliveries to make, new connections to maintain. Because that's what he did. That's what they all did. In Harbor Point, Maine, where everyone mattered and no one was forgotten, where a tat could be a hero and a mail carrier could change lives, where strangers became family and broken things could heal. Home. Not because of the place, though the place was beautiful, but because of the people and the connections between them, and the simple act of showing up day after day through sunshine and storm. Home. In Harbor Point, Maine, where the lighthouse still shines and Captain still walks his routes, the story continues, because the best stories never really end. They just keep delivering, one connection at a time.